And we have
All right. So, by the way, for those of you who haven't attended before, I don't know if you know, but there's a link team agenda doc with a doc for this date. If you want to follow along, I can send out the link. But so let's see.
do you want to lead the meeting today?
Sure. I did something a little different today. I started pulling out these like longer term things that we're tracking into a shepherded items list. This is supposed to have a person assigned to it. The ideal goal would be to have not too many people with the same assignee. We'll see. It's a historical record. And the idea is that you can, if you're shepherding something, you can like drop in some updates to help people come along. In this case, I think two of them are, so the RFC 2753, that's the unwinding RFC, sort of unwinding / FFI interaction or whatever you want to call it. And that I think we should discuss in more depth as like the main topic. But the other thing that came up was there was a minor discussion around the non-exhaustive attribute that Central left some notes on. Do you want to summarize it, Central?
So we had a discussion on the tracking issue where we stabilize in whether the combination of non-exhaustive and vector C on some type should trigger the improper C-type state. And so I think we came to the conclusion that inside the crates, the lint should not trigger because, well, the function of non-exhaustive is not to make it non-exhaustive inside the crate, but just outside the crate. But outside the crates, if you combine the recurrency and the non-exhaustive, it is as if there were no recurrency because you sort of don't want to expose that to everyone because you might add something at a later point in time. So we wanted to check if everyone is fine with that, having the lens function in that way.
Just to spell it out a little more, the idea is that non-exhaustive attribute is a sign you might add more fields or more variants, which would change the size of your struct and so on. So if you're sort of implicitly relying on the size by passing it by value to a piece of C code, then you've kind of asking for trouble later on.
What do you? Okay, I'll ask the stupid question. When you say inside versus outside the current crate, the definition of the struct is in the current crate, and therefore the combination of these attributes has to be in the current crate. Are you talking about when a match occurs outside the current crate? What is the context when things being outside the current crate?
So the lint would trigger if you're using the type outside the current crate in FFI.
You have an extern C function that you defined.
Okay. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense.
Cool.
All right.
Seems fine and reasonable, but not blocking.
Yeah, I think it's more of a future improvement. All right, moving on. So let's see how fast we can do these if we want to. So we've got some nominated things. I want to leave some time for 2753, but let's try to get through them. So 64694, there's a PR to fully integrate derived helpers into name resolution. Central, did you look closely at this? Or just skim it?
Not exactly.
Yeah, so I don't really know what it means yet because I didn't read too much. But we were wondering, I guess the question is, does this merit an RFC, or is it something we feel comfortable doing? Do we want to try to decide this today, or just we can try to look at it and decide it next time? I kind of feel like I'd like to understand better what's happening before I say anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sergio and Alex and David have been commenting on it.
Can someone, can I assign an item to someone to like summarize it next time, or should we all try to do it?
So it sort of is summarized in Petrushenko's second comment. There are two aspects which we would not do, or rather we would do if we reformulate things to take into account mean resolution. If you search for
talking about this
not, capital not, yeah, the two nots are the most interesting ones. And I wonder if that had any interactions with like bigger expansion and BRC that Felix was assigned to.
Yeah, so I feel like I can't process this right now. It's going to take me 5 minutes to read that statement. Felix, would you be game to like read it and try to come up with an intelligent opinion, a recommendation for next time, and we can all try to read it too?
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm going to say Felix.
Okay, I will reassign the PR to Felix.
All right. Why are you doing this like this?
F clock, maybe. It's probably F clock because of my Mozilla account.
I can't type today. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Deprecate. Oh, okay. Deprecate plugin and plugin registrar with removal deadline 1.44.0. So summary is we have these plugin mechanisms. Central's trying to deprecate them. They're still in use by Servo and possibly other people. We don't really know if it's a growing set or not. Is that correct?
Sometimes people turn up on internals and the tracking issue and sort of like, oh, I want to use this and I want to rely on this. Sometimes that can be fixed by both macros and sometimes not.
So it's pretty unclear, or it's pretty clear that we don't want to stabilize it. So I also think we don't want to break Servo or a major consumer like that without some nice alternatives. One compromise we discussed is starting to emit some kind of warning. I think this is more of a heads up at the moment, but I guess we could a few minutes to talk it over.
Regarding emitting, like picking between a lint or not a lint, I think it would be a good idea to not do this as a lint, because then we give it like a fairly firm nudge to like transition away from this over time, maybe in like a year or something.
When you say a lint, like, are you equating that with silenceable in some way? In other words, if it were if it required a command line flag, for example, to silence it, would that make a difference to you or not?
I would just do it as a lint because it's easier to implement. That's what I'm familiar with.
I mean, I thought you were saying you don't want a lint. Sorry, maybe I misunderstood.
Yeah, but so I'm equating that with not being able to silence it, basically.
I think it should be silenceable, but I think the text should be pretty clear, and maybe the real question is: should we actively work to produce an alternative that will satisfy Servo? Like, how much energy do we want to put into taking this out? I think the answer is probably not a lot. Yeah. So a lint, we should settle with a warning and move on.
I think it's a big project. It's far outside roadmap goals, and it's also like giving Servo what they actually want to be able to do this on stable has pretty bad forward compatibility risks in terms of other places in the language, stabilizing the type system, and so on.
Yeah, it would take careful design. I mean, there's a.
Yeah.
Okay. I agree with that assessment. I think we should just make a warning and see if that helps. A firmly worded warning.
Yeah. All right. It's only one object to, and it seems like we want a lint in that case. That will be a bit more complicated to implement, but it's basically just a visitor that checks for the attributes.
Yeah.
The thing Nico said in pre-triage that I thought was interesting is just that I don't know that as Lang we have to run this.
I agree. It's not.
If you
really
want to run if compiler wants to run this on their own, it's a compiler cost. So it's a compiler thing to have the plan to remove, I think.
I agree.
If Servo wants to start proposing an alternative or something like that, obviously we'll look into that. But if they want to propose an RC for it or something along those lines, but
typically language feature removal is also Lang, but yeah, I guess I'm doing so much hacking on the compiler. It's in the compiler now that I sort of.
right.
I think we can let.
I feel like as
drive,
Lang we've said
Yeah.
I feel like as Lang we've sort of said this doesn't have a future in current form.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's the
I don't
decision
think it should be on our agenda.
as far as.
Okay.
Yeah, let's track it through the compiler team, but that's our recommendation.
Right. I will redo the PR and make a new one or something.
Cool. Okay. So recommendation: add a warning, but track through compiler team. Stabilize proc macros, generating macro rules items. This is another one of those
We haven't
things
tested this.
with
Yeah.
somewhat detailed things. But seemed the main thing that stuck out at me was this feature is de facto stable and actively relied upon by the ecosystem through the proc macro hack. I didn't really read into this hygiene business yet, but it feels kind of like we're probably gonna, if people are using it in practice. But what is this PR doing then? It must be doing something.
I read it. It's just derives already can generate macro rules items, but other proc macros can't. So people currently who want to generate a proc macro rules item generate a derive, which generates a macro rules item.
So is there? Do someone?
And Fedoshenkov's comment also says there's no bugs. No one has never received negative reports about. We should not stabilize it. So
we could move to stabilize. I don't know. I think I'd be all right.
Maybe we could also assign this to Felix and if Felix thinks.
Yeah, I can take it on as to just sort of general review of these macro type things. Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, and some kind of stabilization report would be great. But probably cribbing a lot from what was already there if we do decide to go that way. Decide how this. Oh, come on, Felix. Why? Someone fix that.
Change your email address, Felix.
Just send it to @doc. No one will mind.
At what? Okay.
Oh, there was a thing where if you do never mind. I'll talk to him about this.
Extend must use to nested structures.
So this is one thing we discussed previously, and we sort of wanted to create one, and Barkor finally did that. So if you look at the creator run, it says that 2,000 crates regressed, but that's not actually what happened. So those are all the must uses that currently exist, more or less. He just made the creator run into denying everything, so that's all. But there are few there are a few cases which this one quotes, which indicate bugs, more or less.
So the change here again is that if the must use is contained within
it makes the
all levels, any number of levels of structs, basically.
Yep.
Okay.
I read Varkar's comment that says that only 1 in 20 has new behavior. That's still 100 crates if there's 2,000 breakages.
Yeah, but it's a warning, so.
Oh, that's what
right.
it is.
Yeah, it's not.
But like, even like the first, like he lists examples, which it seems like he suggests are bugs, but like the first example is not a bug. Like there are results in fields of features, which are just a part of the feature, like operating, like it's not a bug to drop a select. Like that's cancellation is a part of how feature works.
Mm-hmm.
And like, so that's like a, a core infrastructure rate that's now going to produce a bunch of warnings.
Yeah.
So I think that this PR definitely at minimum needs a way to turn it off, right? It needs like which I think is discussed on the thread. But even then I think that it's going to take a serious rollout to not be producing warnings in everyone's crates.
It seems like tuples there might be some cases worth breaking down, but I agree that if we're like flagging on core future APIs, that's not so good. Do you think you could leave a comment to that effect, both?
Yeah.
Didn't we do tuples in a previous?
Yeah, arrays and tuples are already
okay.
done.
Yeah, this is because it's saying like the first example, if you click in Rucker's comment link 1, right, it's like a bunch of different like feature combinators which are all saying they must be used, and that's not like accurate. So
I just realized that y'all probably couldn't hear me for the last little while.
No.
Yep.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing about that. I had initially requested and sort of started this whole extend must use thing because I had tuples that had results in them that weren't getting warnings thrown for them, and I wanted those. And that already got added in a separate CL.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
so there are some other cases that are like results not being used in nested positions, which
I'm sure it exists, but I mean, the problem is that right now people think that they can put a result in their struct as a part of like its internal operations, and this will mean they then need to annotate it if they're doing that, and like that's a pretty big like disruptive change to everyone.
That seems like something we could add to the must use annotation, like must use not recursive or some sort of.
I mean,
can't
they just put the must use if they want it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting side to Boats's point there of like, if you have the result in your type, you don't need this because you can just mark it must use. I wonder if there's a form that's like, if it only triggers for things that are generically holding a must use type through a generic that wouldn't always be must use, or if it's a public field that is must use because it's more of a pod kind of a type where they're expecting you to look at the fields or something like that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I propose that we push back with this support and let Varkar iterate to see if they can find one without false positives.
Yeah. Mentioning visibility would be good. Like, that public thing is important, I think.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
But I also think that even it's just like a change in the default, right? Like currently the default is not very heavy on must use, right? It's like assumes that you're like intentionally like that you will mark it must use if you need to be must use.
Right.
But this just changes it so instead if you're going to use it and don't want it to be must use, you have to mark it that's the case. And that's like it's possible for us to make that change. It's just like disruptive, and so we have to do it in a slow, like we probably have to have an RFC. We have to figure out how we're going to communicate it to everyone.
Sure, but there are examples where we did in fact like start warning and produce disruptive lints like dying traits. We did have an RFC for that, but
Yeah, exactly.
Have,
just, I mean,
that
it
one
seems
is
like the
much
kind of
more
thing that
disruptive.
it's disruptive in the same way that the addition changes work. Yeah, and so like it's the kind of thing that we need to do in a way that it involves everyone and not just like PR.
I think I agree
I think
with that.
there's a statement there around Dyn that's like, if this is changing conventions drastically enough, it needs an RFC.
Yeah.
I was going to write this and I feel pretty good about this.
Oh, that's fair.
Sounds like boats, you might be good for that.
Yeah, I'll write up a comment about like the features API and what I think the next steps here.
I will on the next.
Right, time check, 3:23. I'm going to go a little bit fast through some of these nominated issues. So how to handle reservation impulse. We added this reservation thing for the bank type. I don't want to discuss it in detail in this meeting, but one thing we had to figure out was how to display it in RESTdoc. There's a proposal that will sort of show the reserved impl, but with a comment and we link to the tracking issue for detailed explanations.
I would propose that we track
have an opinion, take a look.
team and the trust team.
Yeah, I don't think it's really, I also agree it's not that much. Well, yeah. Anyway, it's not super lang, but take a look if you care. It's a quality issue. Incorrect undefined behavior on static references created from pointers. I think we were going to bring Ralph in for this. Is that right? We're going to try to get Ralph in for another round and do a bunch of undefined behavior stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I would also not like to make any waves here because we're changing the qualification stuff at the moment. So.
Oh, right. This was actually blocked on Ralph and or Nico organizing the meeting that I didn't organize. Like calling up his people. Okay, which is on the action item already. And future-proofing non-exhaustive, we covered this already. All right. Woo! Thank you for your patience. Maybe in the future.
You'd be happy static mute, we will consider some other time.
Which one's that? Oh yeah, we said we were going to block. Yeah. So let's talk about the RFC 2753. We have in here, I don't know who's here there's at least Kyle and I actually don't know, AC Fultz or whatever your actual name is.
Adam.
And Adam, who are here, who have been involved in the conversation. Earlier, we made some notes, me and Batman AOD, and I actually asked GNZLBG to take a look as well, that we could sort of drive to summarize what the state of the thread is and what we want to do. Should we go through that? Does that make sense? How do we want to do this? Let's do it. So if you recall, this has been a long-standing issue. The RFC adds this, has kind of come around to this proposal to add an ABI, a custom ABI with the name is somewhat in dispute, and there's some meaning to these two different names. So there's a kind of design question, although in a way there isn't, because in terms of the effects that are observable at this moment, I think both of these alternatives are kind of equivalent, and that's kind of what the dispute is about, is what will happen in the future and what exactly are we promising, and what's an okay amount of stuff to promise. So the basic idea is that we would extend either with what's called extern C unwind, which means a C function that unwinds using whatever the native unwinding mechanism is as derived from the target specification. So that it may unwind, and that would mean like maybe it's dwarf on Linux, but whatever that thing is called, SEH on Windows or whatever, MSVC, I guess. And in contrast, the other alternative would be extern C panic, which is saying that it unwinds using whatever unwinding mechanism Rust is using. Now at present, Rust uses the native unwinding mechanism, so there's no difference. But if Rust adopted a different unwinding mechanism in the future, like maybe we pass Booleans or something, then this would change, whereas the native one would not, unless the native one changed. Is that correct? Good summary for those?
I would say that's, yes.
Yep, sounds good.
And as far as I know, there's really no use case for this version, like for the Rust version, I mean. In other words, it's not like we need this for some things, we want that. Like, we would never really want both that we know of. What you might want to be able to do is have DLLs that have Rust code. But in that case, you probably really want extern Rust, not extern C anyway. You just want a stable ABI that you can rely on, which is a different problem. I think that's correct. So the concern is, like, if we're, how to summarize the concern? The concern is essentially, which of these should we pick? And is it sort of unprecedented that we would be stabilizing, like, are we actually enabling any more stable code? And what guarantees are we making to that code? And I think the answer is we're basically not actually allowing you to write any new stable code with just this change, because there's a whole bunch of interactions. If you actually have functions that unwind, that exception passes between native code and Rust code, there are a lot of questions that would have to be answered that we're not trying to answer. So in fact, you cannot write like fully defined behavior with just this change. But in practice, you can write code that works. Also correct?
That sounds like a good summary.
And so the goal then would be that hopefully we move on, or well, like if we stopped here, we haven't really solved the problem exactly. We just kicked it down the road. But if we keep going and we do come up with answers such that, or at least partial answers for some of these questions, and then we might actually solve the problem, at least for some use cases. I think that makes sense. I think what GNZLPG is upset about from my conversation with them has been two things. One, that they've that the conversation has meandered and been ill-structured, and there's been a lot of repeating and so on, which is a problem we're probably all familiar with from long RFCs. That would be one, and I forgot what I was going to say for two. I guess two would be that maybe exactly this concern that we're not actually enabling stable code, and we're going to have more de facto dependencies or something like that.
Yes, I believe an actual quote from them was, "That's not a stable feature by definition."
Right.
You know, you're proposing this for stabilization, but what the feature you're proposing is inherently not stable.
And I think that's not wrong. We're proposing a stable syntax with like. But the other thing I would say is that I feel like I think they would be pretty happy if we just said this part. I'm not sure if that would. I haven't been able.
They've definitely said they would. They've definitely said they would prefer that.
Right. I guess it's not enough, which is the point. But
in fact, one comment said, "I would be all in for this," but others gave me pause about whether that's actually the case. But yes.
So Josh isn't here, and I don't quite know Josh's opinion, but my opinion is this is what I would want anyway, extern C unwind, because I don't know of a use case for this alternative version. It's maybe worth talking through some of the like future evolutions that might occur, but basically it seems like this seems like what people would actually want is to say, I'm linking to a function that unwinds in the way that my target unwinds.
What does that mean for Rust mechanics though?
Like if you're unwinding from Rust back to yourself, back to Rust,
I think the answer is currently it's undefined. First of all, we haven't settled all of those questions. But if we were to change, all we're saying here is what unwinding that function is allowed to do. We don't say anything about what unwinding Rust does, right? And so if we were to change how extern Rust handles unwinding, that would require some sort of shims at the boundary to interconvert. Of course, we actually said it's still kind of UB to actually pass an exception, so it doesn't technically require that because we said you're not supposed to do that. But it would require it to make something that actually functions.
And that should presumably have some runtime performance cost, which
yeah, but if you want
trying to avoid.
Well, but you can't avoid it if you're going to have a panic that passes between two different. Like the only way to avoid that runtime cost is not to change the Rust unwinding mechanism, which I actually think we'll never do. I should also add that, but that's my personal opinion. Never say never, but like it's not well motivated.
I would really like to not stabilize the ABI for unwinding.
Why is this not implementation defined behavior instead of undefined behavior in the same way that
I mean, it's
overflow is implementation defined?
I think I'm using the term sloppily. I'm not sure.
Yeah,
it's actually implementation defined. I think that's the point. We're trying to change it, I guess, from one to the other. But
and what is that? Seems like we have lots of things that are in that state.
But before I would say that is actually a kind of a motivating factor for the original RFC here is from Rust's perspective right now, I think it's valid to say that that unwinding out of FFI is fully undefined, not just implementation defined. But because of two things. One, the no unwind issue that they insert the LLVM attribute, and then secondly, because of the attempts to insert the abort shim. And the argument being your code was truly undefined. It was not implementation defined. Us inserting an abort shim is totally valid and not a breaking change for valid code. Whereas if it were implementation defined, I think that would be a concrete difference, but mostly just a difference of messaging.
I think that
we are allowed to make breaking changes to implementation defined.
It seems like it's not an actual difference, right? Like we could still put an abort shim. Go on, Central.
Implementation defined. I interpret that as saying that Rust-C must define what behavior it uses, and then it can never change that behavior. So it's stable for Rust-C, but not some other Rust compiler. Or maybe it's stable for the LLVM backend, but not like Brainlift or something.
It's really not obvious whether all changes are like questions of what, everything's actually based on precedent and what people will tolerate. So there's not really. If we felt pretty strongly we wanted overflow to panic even in release builds, right? We could try to do that.
I think that the point is, I think Central's comment is kind of on target though. Implementation defined would be, except with one caveat, would be that Rust-C defines what the behavior is, and Rust-C could define it to not be defined. But I think it's kind of not that important at the end of the day. The point is, we're not really saying what happens here yet. You can rely on it, but it's at your own risk. But I think we should have a plan. This is a valid use case that people want, and I would like us to continue working and not stop here.
But
I think that. Go ahead.
I just think that it's better for people to be depending on implementation defined behavior than on undefined behavior.
Right, we don't want LLVM undefined behavior.
Yeah.
Because that's
we're not going to miscompile their code.
So I would. The thing that's important to me is that Rust for now Rust-C is the only Rust compiler more or less, and I think we should be able to make changes if for example we want to use two return channels instead, or adopt to some changes in C and C++, for example. They're discussing some sort of there are proposals to make C and C++ work better with respect to exceptions, and I think we should be able to be able to consider those in the future.
Yeah, but I think I agree. That's a goal. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, I think there's a caveat on the earlier comment that implementation defined stabilizes something forever for one implementation. And I would say that if we're following the C and C++ precedent, that's not true.
Okay.
Implementation defined, if the implementation changes, the definition can change, and a version change is a change.
Oh, I see. So what I would ask is that we rather that we spell out what these things mean in some detail. Like, are we allowed to change things? And I would like that we would be able to do that.
So like spell out the kind of changes that we anticipate, and
instead of saying implementation, instead of saying implementation defined, like everyone knows what that means exactly, we just say what we mean by the term.
I have two things to insert. First, I want to make an analogy that I think a good analogy for this would be the Rust ABI itself, actually, which is to say that we don't guarantee or specify what the Rust ABI is, but that doesn't mean it's like UB to call a Rust function, right?
Right.
And I think we want something kind of like that. So from version to version, it could change, but within a version, it's like consistent. And one important caveat is that the behavior today varies dramatically between Windows and Linux and so on. So it's not like we have a totally consistent behavior on a lot of these questions. But central directly to your point, I outlined what would happen if a new unwinding mechanism arose that C++ compilers were adopting, and some of the ways we might handle it up here. And I don't think there's really basically, I think there's no problems, and there are a variety of ways we could handle it with different, that depends a little bit on like how broadly adopted is it, what kind of trade-offs do we have. Like we could add a new target, or we could change the existing target. We can do that already. We sometimes do, like to say we're going to use new instructions that, we no longer care if a Pentium added it, that's okay, it's good, it's new enough, even though it breaks 486 processes. But like we have to be pretty sure that that's not going to make people too upset. Like those kinds of changes happen in the ecosystem, and they get phased in, and we'll deal.
Yeah, I'm mostly asking for like clarity in the text so that everyone actually agrees on. And in general, I would be happy if much of the discussion in the RC actually made it into the text. That will take some time on Kyle's part, I guess. But that would be nice.
Yeah,
to have the time to do that.
I plan to put time into that, and
So okay, so if we try to, is there a general consensus in this meeting that if we were to extend the RFC to explicitly talk about some of the future extension scenarios that we anticipate, perhaps describe, and how they might be handled, but the point is saying these are the kinds of things we do not intend to disallow, essentially, are intended to be allowed, these kinds of transitions. And we did those things, we would feel comfortable moving forward with the RFC.
I want to just, I hate to be devil's advocate here, but the thing I'm reminded though is the epic story of when we were thinking about the drop order of fields and structs, and we had this attitude then of being like, well, we'll just leave it unspecified what the order is, and we'll just say we have the freedom to change in the future. But we ended up in the end saying, no, we're just going to stabilize what's implemented because it's too scary to break what's out there. And so I'm hearing the conversation, I'm saying, are you actually believing people are going to listen when we say this?
That's a very good point.
I think they're not analogous whatsoever. Okay, that's a little too strong, but I think there are some key differences, but mainly that the behavior before made sense, or it was like there has to be some order, and it was in an order, and it was consistent across all platforms, and so forth. But the behavior around, like when native codes, the behavior around code raising exceptions and crossing stack frames is pretty inconsistent across platforms, and not particularly amenable to a lot of use cases.
I think it's going. I would actually expect it to be, whether or not it's something we can provide, it's something that as this feature becomes better supported, as the messaging becomes more supportive of, yes, you can, have stronger guarantees about exercising these cross-language unwind things. I think people will want more and more similar behavior between platforms, and just generally expect it to work more and more like C++ exceptions is kind of my that's what I expect the desire would be. Not that we would have to promise to support that, but I think that's a valid concern that there is a risk that the closer we get to just saying, well, yeah, C++ exceptions behave the way you'd expect them to, we would be locked into that, so to speak.
Can I add one other? You know what we need is a queue, I feel like, and it's hard to tell if people are holding their hands up.
I think Felix makes a good point, even in terms of drop order and such. Doing that, like stabilizing it, has reduced our freedom non-trivially. So, even if it was consistent and so on, yeah.
Boats, I think I cut you off.
I was just like the way that someone would depend on this would be that they're raising an exception in like a dilib or something. Like just if they raise an exception from C, it has to be compiled like using the same unwinding mechanism that Rust is the Rust version they're linking against is using. That's like the requirement that we're imposing on everyone from now on if we make it like implementation defined behavior to unwind. Isn't that?
I think so. An example of a behavior someone might be relying on that we might not always want is that if you call a C++ function today and it throws and that exception gets caught outside of the, like if there's Rust code sandwiched between two C++ exceptions, I think what happens is that the Rust code destructors do not run. All resources leak. I don't know why someone would actively want that behavior, actually, but I think that's the current behavior, at least on some platforms. So maybe someone relies on that, but like I said, it seems to me that the behavior is somewhat fragmented, but I have one other thought. Something I wanted to say after this is that what I don't want us to do is stop with this RFC. So I think it would be great, and AC Fultzer and Adam, right? Adam and Kyle have agreed that that they would be willing to do this. I think we should sort of commit that we're going to do this RFC, but as part of a bigger effort to actually make a full story for some use cases, so that we don't have this problem of people relying on accidental behavior because we're like actually getting it done, and we don't just have accidental behavior. We have behavior that we thought about. And I think if the problem will be if we let it sit for 3 years and come back, and then maybe it's going to be baked in there.
I would also like us to not go wild and stabilize the ABI and do that in general.
Yeah, we don't need to we shouldn't need to stabilize the Rust ABI. But what we would, it is some amount of work to answer some of these questions. I mean, there's a reason that this behavior varies between platforms, I think, because it was as Alex said, he kind of did it the easiest way he could.
It sounds like something that maybe should be spun into the unsafe code guidelines and statured by collaboration between those working groups. And
why? I mean, that seems okay to bring them in, but I feel like it's a unique effort with its own. I think we should just call it its own thing. FFI.
I just think there are a lot of people there who were
for sure
good at this.
Yeah, we should definitely get input from those people.
Gen Z. Yeah.
But we should figure out how to organize and who to talk to. The main thing is, are we game to keep working on this?
I'll definitely agree. If we can keep momentum going and active work on experimenting with what the future is going to be and finding it quickly, that's a lot more palatable to me than what happened with the drop field thing, where we talked about changing it and then let 3 years go by without doing anything, without making any changes, and thus we were stuck.
It's sort of also locked on changes in C and C++ and code difference and such in some respects, so it's not completely up to us.
I don't think that's actually true, but we can discuss that a little bit.
In terms of changes, I mean.
No, I mean, I think that we would not be defining if new unwinding mechanisms arise in the future, we would talk about how to incorporate them possibly in the future, right? But like as a new target, we'd have to add support for and so on. But I think a good idea would be, if we were going to do this, to first agree on what is the scope that we're trying to solve, and like that seems like a first thing to outline. I imagine in terms of use cases, like we want to enable enough to do X and Y, and these things we want to not enable enough to do yet, or something.
So if I'm like putting this into my own words, I think we want more clarity in general about use cases and limitations and whatnot. And that makes sense.
Yes.
And when we say things are out of scope for this effort, what would that mean exactly? You know, out of scope for this RFC, out of scope for indefinitely?
I'm thinking for this effort, I don't mean this RFC. I mean this RFC and successor RFCs produced by this working group that we create to follow it along.
Right, more like a roadmap.
Yeah.
Sort.
An example of something I would consider out of scope would be defining the Rust ABI or proposing alternative panicking mechanisms. I think we would take it as a constraint that Rust can alter its, like we would explore what it means if Rust alters its panicking mechanism, but we wouldn't define a new one.
Right, thinking about possible future work and future compatibility is, I think, a good idea.
I think another thing, no,
10
similar.
minutes.
Yeah. It probably comes down to finishing the RFC, the successor RFC that you started, or some subset of it. I haven't actually looked at the full set of things in that RFC. You can always
roll, like, the RFC format has place for future work, and I think it's actually a good idea to flesh that out in one document so you don't have to like read 5-6 different places where it's very scattered at the moment. Just having some centralization is, I think, a good idea.
So, yeah, 10 minutes. The RFC should centralize future work, should clarify questions it intentionally does not answer, leaves for future work. We have, I don't know if I want to say consensus, but I'm proposing to spin out a working group with Batman, AOD, and or AC Fultzer as lane team shepherd. I can write a more formal proposal perhaps, and I'm willing to serve as a liaison because I want to see how this goes, but could have somebody else. This would be a big effort though, potentially, so maybe better someone else. But that should be ideal.
It's actually, I think it makes sense that you lead this actually.
I feel like I have a kind of idea of what I want it to be. So I kind of want to.
Josh has been, I think, the most involved so far.
Yeah, I'm happy to hand off to Josh when he gets back from his vacation. He's just away for a month. And he did ask me if I can follow along for him. So, and I guess the key point is we are comfortable landing a syntactic change, because I think this is one of the points of dispute, that doesn't yet fully enable like stable code that works, as long as we have a plan to finish up remaining pieces rather than leaving them to blind luck.
By stable code that works, do you just mean have well-defined behavior, like fully specified behavior?
Yes, that's what I mean. Fully enable. That's what I mean by stable is fully specified, but let me use better, less ambiguous terminology.
Okay, so it would be, so we are comfortable landing a syntactic change that could in fact be used in production, so to speak.
As long as, but there's a, yeah, right.
That there's caveat.
Yeah,
Rust stable.
I think this is a key point that we haven't actually discussed explicitly, which is, would we stabilize this syntax before all the rest of the pieces are done? I personally would be okay with that.
See, unstable? You mean unwind?
I mean unwind. But we don't necessarily have to answer this question today, but I think this is something that is important to Adam, for example.
Yeah.
So before we do this, stabilize this, I would like to see, like in the RCs, see the clarifications around what we mean by implementation defined and what freedoms we have and don'ts and so on and so forth. Like the things we discussed before with respect to fleshing out the RC in general.
Yeah, so right, so you're about, essentially how I interpret that is, I'd rather not answer that until we've done some of the work we said we were going to do up above. And then that would affect the answer.
Some of it, like thinking about the future, not implementing the future. So,
right, that's what I mean. That's the work I mean. Yeah. Like centralize rationale, clarify what implo-defined behavior means, etc.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, I think I've written out all my thoughts on that, but again, they're spread out in that long thread. So I have some verbiage that I can put into into the RFC itself, and then point you to it, and the team can decide how well it, whether the freedoms it guarantees for future design and the guarantees it gives to users are compatible and appropriate.
Yeah, and likewise in the thread, I laid out some of my thinking about what stability of this feature would mean to me as like a downstream consumer of it. So maybe that'll help as well.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's I would say probably Gunzelbug's main concern is that users will then say, "Hey, this is stable. It cannot break." And where does that limit us, and in what cases can we say no, that's not true?
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. If we have something explicit to point at that says yes, we can in these circumstances, that would help. And then there are some to-dos in the document that would be nice to flesh out as well, like literally to do.
Yeah, that is, yes, by design.
Well, yeah. All right, Joe.
Oh, by the way, in case anyone hasn't seen, which is completely unrelated to this thing, we are throwing out the AST borrow checker. Yay.
It's happening. .gif. All right, cool. Anything else in the last 4 minutes? Otherwise, our timing was like very good. All right, great. Then see you all later.
All right.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Bye.
See y'all.